At the outbreak of World War I in August of 1914, Lord Kitchener, who was the British Secretary of State for War, believed very early on that overwhelming manpower would be the key to winning the war. So he began to look for ways to encourage men of all classes to join the British Army. Now, this was a concept that flew in the face of centuries of British military tradition, in which the British Army had always relied on a very small but professional group of soldiers. And they had always drawn the members of their officer class from the gentry, and the lower classes were where they got most of their enlisted men. But it was General Sir Henry Rawlinson, who would go on to command the army here at the Somme, who suggested that men would be more inclined to enlist in the army if they knew that they were going to serve alongside their friends, family, and co-workers. And so he appealed to London stockbrokers to raise a battalion of men from the workers in the city of London to set an example. 1,600 men enlisted in what became the 10th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, the so-called Stockbrokers Battalion, within a week in late August of 1914. A few days later, the Earl of Derby decided to raise a battalion very similar to that out of men from Liverpool. Within 2 days, 1,500 men had joined this new battalion. Speaking to these men, Lord Derby said, quote, "This should be a battalion of pals, a battalion in which friends from the same office will fight shoulder to shoulder for the honor of Britain and for the credit of Liverpool," end quote. Within the next few days, 3 more battalions were raised in Liverpool. And so these 4 battalions formed the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th battalions of the King's Regiment. Encouraged by Lord Derby's success, Lord Kitchener promoted the idea of organizing similar recruitment drives all throughout Britain. By the end of September of 1914, more than 50 towns had formed PALS battalions. The larger towns and cities were able to form several battalions each. So, for example, Manchester, they were able to raise 4 battalions in August and 4 more a few months later. From the perspective of the War Office, these PAL battalions were just an incredible experiment because they relieved the heavy strain not only on recruiting a suddenly much more expanded regular army, but they also relieved the financial strain because they decided in September of 1914 that the organizers of these battalions would be responsible for meeting the initial costs of their accommodation and other training costs until the War Office would take over. And that worked out really well for the War Office, but also for the men, because this meant that many of these new recruits in these PALS battalions were initially able to live at home. They would go to training during the day in their local community with the other men, and then they would come home after a day of basic training. The Accrington PALs are probably the best remembered of the battalions that were raised in the early months of the First World War in response to Kitchener's call for a volunteer army. Groups of friends from all walks of life in Accrington and its neighboring towns enlisted together to form their own battalion with a distinctively local identity. A month after the outbreak of the war, the Accrington Observer and Times newspaper of September 8, 1914, reported that the War Office had accepted an offer made by the mayor of Accrington, Captain John Harwood, to raise a complete battalion. When recruitment began on the 14th of September, 104 men were accepted in the first 3 hours. Brothers, cousins, friends, workmates enlisted together, and within 10 days, the Accrington Battalion had all but reached a full strength of 1,100 men. Now, around half the battalion had been recruited from Accrington. The majority of the remainder had been raised in neighboring towns, such as Burnley, Chorley, and Blackburn. But they all came from basically the same area. Throughout the early months of the battalion's existence, the men trained and drilled in and around their hometowns, like most of the PALS battalions did. In February of 1915, they were given this magnificent send-off as they left Accrington for training at Carnarvon, where Lieutenant Colonel A.W. Rickman of the Northumberland Fusiliers took command of the battalion. In May of 1915, the battalion moved from Carnarvon to Penkridge Bank Camp near Rugeley, outside of Birmingham, where it joined the 12th, 13th, and 14th battalions of the York and Lancaster regiments to form the 94th Brigade of the 31st Division. The battalion made further moves in July and then in September of 1915 before they embarked in December for Egypt, of all places, to counter a Turkish threat against the Suez Canal. That danger soon passed, and in the last week of February of 1916, the 31st Division was ordered to France to take part in the preparations for the joint British and French attack that was to come here at the Somme. The objective of the PALS battalions of the 94th Brigade was to capture the hilltop fortress of Serre and form a defensive flank facing northeast and north. They were the northernmost point on the attack at the Somme on July 1st. That attack was to be led by the 11th East Lancashires on the right and the 12th York and Lancasters, the Sheffield City Battalion, on the left. The 1st and 2nd Barnsley PALS, the 13th and 14th York and Lancasters, were in support, in reserve for those leading battalions. Facing them in Serre was the 169th Infantry Regiment of the German Army, the 8th Baden Infantry. On the 24th of June, as was true all the way along the line, the British artillery opened a bombardment that was to continue until the very morning of the attack. This bombardment was intended to destroy the German defenses, but also open holes in the barbed wire and allow for easy access to the strong points. But it failed to penetrate through to many of the underground shelters, and it left much of the barbed wire intact. In the early evening of the 30th of June, the 11th East Lancashires left their camp at Warnemont Wood for a 7-mile journey to the trenches here in front of Serre. The lead elements didn't even arrive on the front until 2:40 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, July 1st, just a few hours before the attack was meant to commence. These areas were already heavily shell damaged. The buildup had not gone unnoticed by the Germans, and as daylight broke, the forward lines were getting pounded by German artillery. The woods behind me today are known as Sheffield Memorial Park, and it's a place in honor of the members of the PALS battalions who attacked here on the morning of July 1st of 1916. But at the time, they were actually 4 distinct tiny copses of trees, and you can see how it runs all the way down. They've merged together, the trees have grown since then. And they were known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm standing in front of Mark right now. And if we turn around, just on the other side of that cemetery would have been the German lines. It was only about 300 yards. And so you could think, okay, 300 yards, we could do that. We can cross that amount of territory. Beyond that, right where the woods are is where the village of Serre is actually located. But it wasn't as easy as it looked, as the men found out very quickly. So here's a map that gives you a really good sense of things. We are right here on the edge. This is about where the Accrington Palace monument is. We are right on the edge of the attack line. This is the 11th Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment. That's the Accrington Pals. And then you can see the other Pals units, and they had moved up over time to where we are now. And then you can see the German lines. There was a machine gun right there. There's other ones here, here, here. And then you can see where they advanced throughout the day. There were 4 trench lines and then fortifications actually inside the town of Serre itself. Just a brutal place to attack. At around 6:30 in the morning, the British artillery began its final bombardment of the German front lines. As shells continued to burst on the Germans' front trench, the men of the 3rd and 4th companies of the German 169th Infantry scrambled from underground shells, bringing up their machine guns, their rifles, and their grenades, ready to put them onto the attacking troops. At 7:30 a.m., the bombardment was lifted from the German front lines, and the leading waves of the Pals battalions rose up and began to walk toward the German positions. They were convinced that the front lines had been eliminated, and so there was really no threat, and so they walked. But they found out almost immediately in that 300 yards of deadly space that the Germans were very much active, and they tore huge holes in the advancing lines of infantry. One British observer likened the lines of dead to, quote, swaths of cut corn at harvest time. Now, as incredible as it seems, groups of Pals defied the machine gun fire. They threaded their way through the barbed wire, and they dropped into the German front line trenches. On their left, some of the 12th York and Lancasters also fought their way through, but it was all in vain. Behind them, the 3rd and 4th waves also suffered horrifying losses before they even reached no man's land because of the German artillery. The leading companies of the 13th York and Lancasters were cut down. Some of the Pals, their officers having been killed or wounded, pressed on toward the town of Serre, and they were never seen again. The remaining survivors in the German front line, having received no reinforcements, were forced to withdraw. By 8 a.m., just 30 minutes into the fight, the battle for Serre was effectively over. The history of the East Lancashire Regiment in the Great War records that out of 720 Accrington Pals who took part in that attack, in just the span of a half hour, 584 were killed, wounded, or missing. Brigadier General H.C. Reese of the 94th Brigade said, quote, the result of the high explosive shells, the shrapnel, the machine gun fire, and the rifle fire was such that hardly any of our men even reached the German front trench. The lines which advanced in such admirable order melted away under fire, yet not a man wavered. Not a man broke the ranks or attempted to go back. I have never seen, indeed could never have imagined, such a magnificent display of gallantry, discipline, and determination. Now, back home in England, the initial accounts of success on the Somme, including an erroneous report of the capture of the town of Serre, soon gave way to newspaper pages filled with photographs of the killed, wounded, and missing. Few, if any, of the town's population could have been untouched by the tragedy. Percy Holmes, who was the brother of one of the original members of the PALs, recalled, quote, "I remember when the news came through to Accrington that the PALs had been wiped out. I don't think there was a street in Accrington that didn't have their blinds drawn, and the bell at Christ Church tolled all the day." Sergeant John William Streets, who was one of the PALs. He was in the 12th Battalion, York and Lancaster, the Sheffield PALs. He was also a poet. He wrote these words: "Behind that long and lonely trenched line to which men come and go, where brave men die, there is a yet unmarked and unknown shrine, a broken plot, a soldier's cemetery." Sergeant Streets was killed in the attack on Serre on the morning of July 1st. His body lay in no man's land, as thousands of others did, for almost 10 months before he was eventually recovered, and he was believed to have been buried here at the Euston Road Cemetery. He was 31 years old. This is a memorial to him. Around the time his body was recovered, a collection of poems that he wrote was posthumously published under the title "The Undying Splendor." And this is what he wrote: "Reach out thy hands, thy spirit's hands to me, and pluck the youth, the magic from my heart, magic of dreams, whose sensibility is plumed like the light, visions that start, mad pressure in the blood, desire that thrills, the soul with mad delight to yearning wed. All slothfulness of life draw from its bed, the soul of dawn across the twilight hills. Reach out thy hands, O Spirit, till I feel that I am fully thine, for I shall live in the proud consciousness that thou dost give. And if thy twilight fingers round me steal and draw me unto death, thy votary am I, O life. Reach out thy hands to me." To many people, the story of the Somme is what happened on July 1st, 1916. The bloodiest day in the history of the British Empire. Over 19,000 men killed in a matter of hours. Another 30,000 wounded. But the fighting went on here at the Somme for another 4 months. One of the divisions that was not involved in the action on July 1st was the 38th Division. It was part of General Sir Henry Rawlinson's 4th British Army, and like many of the divisions here at the Somme, the 38th was part of what was called the New Army, or Kitchener's Army. The men who answered Lord Kitchener's call for volunteers early in the war to fill the ranks. Men who a year or two earlier had been in civilian life and probably never expected to serve in something that would be called the war to end all wars. Specifically, these were men from Wales. David Lloyd George, who was a Welsh member of the British cabinet and by the end of 1916 would be Prime Minister, called for an all-Welsh army to be fielded early in the war. Now, this never came into reality, as by this point many of the Welshmen who had enlisted had already been assigned to other units. But an all-Welsh division was formed, and it was originally designated the 43rd Division. In the spring of 1915, there were some redesignations, and it was renamed the 38th Welsh Division. They trained in the UK, but they weren't even fully equipped with rifles until November of 1915. A few weeks after that, they arrived here in France. The division was made up of battalions from the three Welsh regiments, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the South Wales Borderers, and the Welsh Regiment. They were formed into three brigades that were designated the 113th, 114th, and 115th Brigades. Command was given to Major General Ivor Phillips, who was a fellow Liberal member of Parliament from Wales and a friend of Lloyd George. In fact, one of Lloyd George's own sons served as aide-de-camp to General Phillips. Since many of the new army units had already been raised and shipped over to France before them, the 38th ended up with poor quality among their leadership, and there were a number of accusations made about favoritism, as a number of the members of the officer corps owed their appointments in the division to their political connections. The first casualties for the men of the division came before they even experienced combat, mostly due to training accidents involving grenades. The division was then temporarily split up and assigned to the Guards Division and the 19th Division in order to gain experience in the trenches. But by June, the Welsh Division had been reformed and assigned as a reserve here at the Somme, where they began to train for the battle. They were expected to be a part of the second round of attacks in the days following the July 1st assault. It was hoped that that second wave would exploit the gains that had been made by the 3rd and 4th Armies in the first days of the attack and open the road for the cavalry to move its way toward the town of Arras. The first wave of attacks here in this area had driven the Germans from the towns of Mametz and Fricourt, but in between the two villages was Mametz Wood behind me, where the Germans continued not only to hold a strong position, but were also deeply entrenched. It was holding up the British advance, however, and so the 38th Division was brought up to relieve the battered 7th Division here and clear the Germans from Mametz Wood. So we're looking now toward Mametz Wood from the direction of the British lines. The German defensive line was right along the edge of these woods. This was a defense in depth system, so 300 yards behind the first line at the other end of the woods was another German line, which allowed for quick reinforcements that could come up under cover. Now, the Germans who were defending here were from the Lehr Regiment of the Prussian Guard. These were the Kaiser's own bodyguard. They had seen significant combat on the Eastern Front, and there were also units of a Bavarian regiment here. These are some of the best soldiers in the German army here at the Somme, with one of the best remaining defensive positions in the days after the opening attacks. It was open ground. The Welsh were along the tree line, which was right here, as you can see, at this wood. And so we can see perfectly exactly the ground that they had to cover. And they were already well in front of the British trench line, which was actually on the other side of these woods back there. So it was a tough ask for anybody. And so the initial decision was made that they weren't going to attack directly, but rather there would be a two-pronged indirect assault by units from the Welsh Division that would come around over on that side and attack the wood from over here, and then units of the 17th Division that would attack from over on that side toward the wood. On the morning of the 7th of July, after a brief preliminary bombardment and in a pouring rain, the men of the 16th Battalion of the Welsh Regiment and the 11th Battalion South Wales Borderers attacked Mametz Wood on the east behind me here, while the men of the 17th Division launched an attack from the west. It was apparent almost immediately that the bombardment had failed to silence the German machine guns, and the battalions were pinned down in no man's land in this field behind me before getting anywhere near the woods. A smoke screen that was supposed to provide cover never materialized. German artillery began to cut the lines of communication, and that prevented men from going back. And so they were stuck in no man's land, pinned down and forced to start digging in while German snipers picked men and officers off one by one. They waited for friendly artillery support to allow them to start moving forward again. As they were pinned down, a lieutenant named Tregascus of the 16th was hit by a sniper. His brother, another lieutenant, was about 50 yards away, saw his brother go down and came to his side where he was hit as well. Arthur and Leonard Tregascus became the first, but not, sadly, the last pair of brothers to die side by side attacking Mametz Wood. By around 11 a.m., a second attempt was made to reach the wood, this time reinforced by men from the 10th South Wales Borderers. Same result. A planned third attack was eventually called off after it was decided that it would be futile to continue. The war diary of the 16th Battalion of the Welsh Regiment gave an account of the fighting that took place in this field behind me. It said 8:30 a.m., battalion under orders drawn up on their own side of the slope, facing Mametz Wood in lines of platoons with a 2-platoon frontage. 11th South Wales Borderers in support, 10th South Wales Borderers in reserve. Our artillery ceased firing at the wood at 8:30 a.m. and the first lines of the battalion proceeded over this crest, but instantly came under heavy machine gun frontal fire from Mametz Wood and enfilade fire from Flatiron Copse and the German second system, which ran between Mametz Wood and Bazentin-le-Petit. The battalion suffered heavily and had to withdraw to their own side of the crest. Battalion made 2 more attacks, but position was much too exposed for any hope of success, and orders were received to cease operation. 11th South Wales Borderers attempted to approach the wood through a gully running between Caterpillar Wood and the slope mentioned above, but machine gun fire drove them back. Our losses: 6 officers killed, 6 wounded, 268 other ranks killed, missing, and wounded. On the 9th of July, Ivor Phillips was relieved of his command of the division for failing to take Mametz Wood. He was replaced by Herbert Watts, who was already in command of the 7th Division. Watts was told to use the division as he saw fit and to take Mametz Wood at any cost. And so on the morning of July 10th at around 3:30 a.m., the preliminary bombardment began for what was to be a massive frontal assault by the entire division. The men spent the hours leading up to the attack singing Welsh songs, and at just after 4 a.m. they advanced. The divisional history called this attack, quote, one of the most magnificent sights of the war. Wave after wave of men were seen advancing without hesitation and without a break over a distance which in some places was nearly 500 yards. As is the case with any battlefield, coming here and seeing the terrain helps to give a fuller picture of exactly what it was that the Welsh Division was facing. We're looking toward Mametz Wood now from just in front and to the side of the Welsh Memorial. You can see here where the bend in the line is, and the German front line would have been right along the edge of these woods and then would have followed that way, and the British had their own trench that ran along this ridge here, and then they had put in a trench that kind of paralleled the German trench over there. But this is no man's land, and so they had to come down this ridge. The descriptions of the attack by the Welsh talk about them coming up and over the crest, which you can't see, but it's a significant ridge here. Goes back several hundred yards there. Then they would have come down this hill well in advance of the frontline trenches and would have attacked hundreds of yards of open no man's land here. And the men who would have come in on this side would have been facing enfilading fire from there and also fire from the front. And you can see how deep that section goes. And when you get back to where the clearing ends over there, and if you just imagine it running that way, that's just the beginning of these woods. They still go much further back. And so not only are they facing no man's land and facing all the German barbed wire and artillery fire and open ground and machine guns, but then they've got to fight their way through, even after the trees have been destroyed by artillery, which would have been hell in and of itself. Now they've got to face all of the brush and the growth that is happening in those woods. It was just a nightmare of a place to launch a frontal assault. So right here now we are walking along what would have been the Germans, at this point, frontline trench, facing toward the British line. So looking straight over now, you can see the Welsh memorial in the distance there. The British trenches would have been on the other side of that, and the Welsh attack would have come from right where the road is there. And then through these woods, another line of German trenches, and just really difficult terrain to pass through in the meantime. Well, in case you needed reminding that this is a place that a lot of combat happened and that it continues to be a dangerous place, look what somebody must have found. Now, I think this one's probably safe, but that is a big artillery shell right there, right on the edge of the path, just maybe 100 yards here into Mametz Wood. The 14th Welsh crossed no man's land behind a creeping barrage. They entered the wood and they were able to clear the forward German positions here with bayonets and with their rifles. The attacks by the 13th Welsh stalled due to stiff German resistance. The division was reinforced on the right flank by committing the 15th Welsh, who were able to push through and into the wood. But before they could link up and aid the 13th, German troops poured into the gap between the two battalions and got behind the 15th Welsh, where they nearly wiped out an entire company. Just 7 men from that company were able to fight their way through and get back to safety. Now, despite these losses, the 3 battalions of the Welsh regiment were eventually able to form a cohesive line here, defending the edge of the wood and repulse fierce German counterattacks from the second line. Eventually, 2 full brigades of the Welsh division were holding a line here at the edge of the woods. Engineers came up and began the process of helping them to solidify their position with entrenchments and by laying wire. During the night, the 113th and 114th brigades were withdrawn from the wood, and the 115th was moved into their place to push the attack further in. The next day, they prepared an assault to clear out the final Germans from Mametz Wood. Their commanding officer, Brigadier General H.J. Evans of the 115th, wanted to launch a surprise attack, but that was overruled. The bombardment that was meant to support their attack fell short in places and began to hit British troops, but it also drew German artillery fire as a response. In addition to the friendly fire, the barrage also caught up some German troops in the open as they fled out of the wood. The remaining Germans, though, offered stiff resistance, and the 16th Welsh were held up by machine gun fire and the use of a flamethrower. Now, despite all of this, the brigade was able to clear most of Mametz Wood by the end of the day. So, as with most battlefields, especially for the Great War, you have to use your imagination a little bit, just because by the time the battle for Mametz Wood was over, none of these trees like this would have been here. While it was overgrown and there was brush, you have to imagine shell holes everywhere, dead men from both sides everywhere, spent casings from artillery and from small arms fire, and pretty much every one of these trees blasted away several feet off the ground. Robert Graves was a member of the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and he was a gifted writer and a poet. He came into these woods shortly after the battle and said that he found it, quote, full of dead Prussian Guards Reserve, big men, and dead Royal Welsh and South Wales borderers of the new army battalions, little men. Not a single tree in the wood remained unbroken, unquote. He also wrote a poem that was published in 1917. And this is what it said. To you who'd read my songs of war and only hear of blood and fame, I'll say, you've heard it said before, war's hell. And if you doubt the same, today I found in Mametz Wood a certain cure for lust of blood, where propped against a shattered trunk, in a great mess of things unclean, sat a dead Boche. He scowled and stunk with clothes and a face of a sodden green. Big-bellied, spectacled, crop-haired, dribbling black blood from nose and beard. So just as you walk around, you see reminders everywhere of the human cost of the fighting here. Alfred Priestley was in B Company of the 16th Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and he was killed here in that final frontal assault on July 11th, 20 years old. And just tucked away here, along with so many other memorials, is this wreath and this memorial to one of hundreds of Welshmen who died here. At the time of the Great War, Newfoundland was not a part of Canada. It was a separate British dominion. Most of us today think of Newfoundland as in that extreme eastern part of Canada, but at the time it wasn't. And Newfoundland, here at the Somme, as a percentage of men involved, probably suffered the worst. We're standing in the Newfoundland Memorial Park. It is by far the best preserved part of the Somme battlefield, probably one of the best preserved sites on the entire Western Front. You can come here, and in the midst of the Somme River Valley, where you have miles and miles of flat farmland, where in 1916 there were trenches that ran all the way from the channel down to the border with Switzerland. Most of those trenches are gone now. Most of the evidence, other than the cemeteries, most of the evidence that there was ever one of the worst battles in human history here is gone. But here, on I think 70 acres, it's completely preserved. You can see the trenches where the Newfoundlanders were coming out of the trenches to fight. You can actually go across and see the German trenches, and you can better than anywhere else on this battlefield really get an understanding of exactly where everyone was and where the enemy was, and vice versa. And there are even some cemeteries on this property. So we're just going to look around a little bit and talk a little bit about what happened on this site. I know it's difficult to imagine, but these trenches, I know for all of us they define the war, but I don't think we fully understand what life was like here. Yes, there was the mud and the rain and the dirt and the difficult conditions, but the men were in these trenches for weeks, sometimes for months. Sometimes when the shelling got real bad, they couldn't leave. Especially early on in the war, before they were extended and other places were made, men were going to the bathroom in these trenches. They would often use helmets to go to the bathroom in, and then they would dump them over the side as far away from the trench as they could. But you can only do that so much. Often men died in these trenches and they couldn't go out to bury them, and so they buried them in the trench. You were walking over top of your comrades' graves, and you knew that if you were killed, that's where you were going to end up. There are descriptions by the soldiers of just the mass of thousands of flies that would descend on them in the trenches because of the bodies, because of the smell, because of all of the various things that you can imagine. You had to eat there, you had to sleep there, you lived there. You weren't showering, you weren't in a bed, you weren't particularly warm, especially at this time of year. It was take your worst nightmare and multiply it by 10, and then add the drum roll of artillery fire from huge guns, just boom, 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 all the time. Honestly, to me, in studying all of history, if there's one war I would not want to be a soldier in, it was this one. And it's because of that. It's because of the artillery. It's because of the conditions. I just honestly don't know that there's ever been anything like it. As in other places on the battlefield, there was a week-long bombardment of the German position. The German position was off in the distance there. It's an area known as Y Ravine. It's one of the few places on the battlefield where the Germans were actually in a lower position than the British and Commonwealth forces were. Typically they were attacking uphill. But in this case, there's kind of a natural fortification with that ravine. And so the Germans were dug in well there, and it protected them from the artillery, as was the case in most places. And so when the Newfoundlanders rose up to attack, they began to attack over open ground. And you can see just behind me, the main line is about where that monument is. It's probably 100 yards away. And where I'm standing now is about as far as most of them got. Right behind me here are the petrified remains of what is known as the danger tree. It's called the danger tree because this kind of marks the middle of no man's land. It marks the spot that is as far as most of them got, because what happened was right down here, you can see where the ground dips. And so there was this kind of natural dip that if you look across at where the Germans were, I'm right at about the same level as the Germans right now. And so if you dip down, I guess the thought was that the machine gunners could not hit you down there. And that offered some protection. So a lot of men aimed for this position to try and get here, to get down to that position, to get away from the gunfire. But of course, that just meant that a lot of bodies piled up in this area as they all huddled toward the same spot. The casualties were severe. The 1st Battalion suffered 86% casualties on this field. 86%. When we talk about the American Civil War, the gold standard for worst casualties is typically the 26th North Carolina at Gettysburg, who suffered around 80%. The 1st Minnesota was right around that same area, about 80%, but 86%. There were 700 casualties. There were less than 70 men that were available for roll call the next morning. I mean, those are just almost impossible to believe numbers. There were 14 sets of brothers who were killed on this field. 4 lieutenants from the same family died here. When you talk to the people of Newfoundland, this is the place. In all of their history, this is the place that is remembered. This is the place that is honored. It's one of, I think, only 2 places outside of Canada that are Canadian national memorials, national monuments. This is a place of great honor, but also a place of great horror for the people of Newfoundland. The commander of the 29th Division, whose men were attacking here, would go on to say after the battle that it was a magnificent display of valor by these men, and it only failed because dead men can advance no further. That kind of sums it up. This is one of a couple of cemeteries here. This is the Y Ravine Cemetery, and as with other cemeteries, you'll see a lot of July dates and then a lot of November dates, and that indicates that second major attack that happened that took a lot of the ground that they failed to take in July. Interesting to note that in addition to the Newfoundlanders and the Highlanders of Scotland, the 51st Division, who fought here, there are also a lot of South Wales borderers. And if you're familiar at all with the British Army, you may recognize that name. The South Wales borderers were the same regiment, I think it's the 24th Regiment of Foot, that fought in the Zulu War at places like Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. Those were the South Wales borderers. As one who loves history, I really appreciate this monument. It says, "Scotland, by this monument in the land of her ancient ally and comrade in arms, commemorates those officers and men of the 51st Highland Division who fell in the Great War." The alliance between France and Scotland in the years before Scotland and England were united under one crown was known as the Old Alliance, AULD, Alliance. And it was one of the things that helped keep Scotland independent for so long, because she knew she could count on France as an ally to keep England in check from coming and gobbling them back up again. And it was only when Queen Elizabeth passed away in the early part of the 17th century that the throne passed to her cousin, who was the King of Scotland, King James VI, who became King James I of England, and the two became united under one crown and eventually united as the island of Great Britain, and then later the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So there are a lot of stories that come out of the Great War, a lot of lore, a lot of history that gave a lot of units their identities. For example, the United States Marine Corps at Belleau Wood, and the nickname that they came out of the Great War with, the Devil Dogs. And there was always the story that they had been named devil dogs by the Germans because of how they fought, but the fact was that that was a name that probably was given to them by Americans. It appeared in print in the United States long before they went into action in the Great War. There's a similar story that I actually wanted to do an entire video about, and it was going to be titled The Ladies from Hell, about the 51st Highland Division. But as I started doing research into this story, I found out the truth. So the Highlanders wore kilts, and the Germans called them skirts. That part is true. They didn't really understand that culture, that part of Scottish heritage, which really doesn't go back all that far. It certainly doesn't go back to the time of William Wallace, but it is a part of Scottish heritage. And so when these Highlanders showed up fighting that way, the story goes that because of the way that they fought, the Germans nicknamed them the Ladies from Hell. But nothing could be further from the truth. The Germans, probably more than any other army on the Western Front, their soldiers kept diaries, a lot of them, and we have a lot of those. Not a single German soldier ever refers to the Highlanders that way in any of their writings. All of the sources we have that call the Highlanders the Ladies from Hell are on the Allied side. So it's a cool story, and it's kind of neat to think about the Germans calling them that and then seeing how viciously they fought, despite the fact they were wearing skirts as the Germans thought them to be. But the fact is that it's just really kind of a propaganda thing more than anything. But that doesn't take away from how incredibly well these men fought, men such as the Black Watch. And is there a better name for a unit anywhere in the world than the Black Watch? I absolutely love that. And that's a unit that I plan to do a lot more research into before my next trip here. But you have the Gordon Highlanders, and of course you have the PALS battalions from places like Edinburgh and Glasgow, who all fought just incredibly well on these fields. Here's something I've talked about some on the channel. You can see the red sign. They call these red zones for a reason. You have to imagine that in places like the Somme, Verdun, other places along the line, there were literally millions of artillery shells that were fired. Some estimates are as high as a third, but certainly as at least a fifth, somewhere between a fifth and a third of all of those artillery shells that were fired were duds. They didn't explode, which means that there are literally millions of unexploded rounds that were laying all over these battlefields, and many of them are still there. And I don't know what the rate is or how often it happens, but I know people continue to die because of the Great War, because every so often someone encounters one of those unexploded shells and they don't know what it is, or they don't know what to do with it, or they mishandle it, and it goes off and they end up killed. The French army will gather those up. There are places where farmers, for example, when they're plowing their fields and they dig up some of this unexploded ordnance, they'll place them in a pile on the side of the road, and the French army will come around for what they call the iron harvest and gather up what has been harvested that year by the farmers. It's a continual problem, and it's something, you know, as an American, the only war that was really fought on our soil was the Civil War in any large numbers, and even the American Civil War. I mean, there was the Revolution, but it was so small in scale even compared to the Civil War. But the Civil War is dwarfed in comparison to what happened on the Western Front in World War I. And then, of course, they had World War II fought here as well. And so these people live on battlefields that literally can kill them. It's an ongoing issue. So just once again, I want to kind of put in perspective this attack. Just in front of the statue over there, you can see kind of the build-up area where the frontline trenches are for the British. I'm maybe 100 yards away from there now, which puts me right in line with the danger tree. So 100 yards is about as far as most of them ever made it. Now over there, just in front of those trees, is the German frontline trenches. It's probably 300 yards away. It's, I don't know, it's sad, it makes me angry, it's frustrating, but it's not unique to here. That was the way it was all along the lines. And who's to blame for that? Well, you know, a lot of people, the popular thing to do is to blame the generals. In particular, men like General Sir Henry Rawlinson, who was in command of the army who fought here. But the Somme is hardly unique in that. There were plenty of attacks where everyone thought the artillery softened up the target, only to find out that it didn't. I think it's the scale of this attack and the scale of the number of dead. 19,000 British soldiers killed in the first day, most of them within a couple of hours, that people tend to point to about this place. But that wasn't even the greatest loss of life for an army in one day during the Western Front. The French lost more than that in one day back in the early months of the war. I think they lost over 20,000 killed in one day. But for the collective British memory, for the Canadians, for the Scottish, for the Australians and the New Zealanders and the South Africans and the Irish and the men from India and all of these other places, the Somme and Ypres, especially Passchendaele, which was, I think, the third battle of Ypres, those become the things that are in the collective memory as the horrors of the Western Front. And it's hard to get a picture of that today because it's so peaceful and it's so quiet. But when you start to see the cemeteries everywhere, then you start to understand. This was not a place anybody would want to be. And I do this because I want their stories to be told. It's been 100 years, and honestly, I don't think that many people, even people who are interested in history, know a whole lot about the Great War. And I think it was the defining war of the 20th century, not World War II, not Korea, not Vietnam, not Afghanistan, not any of these other places where various nations fought. And I mean the Soviets in Afghanistan, not America, before you send me a message that wasn't the 20th century. It was here. This was the defining moment of the 20th century and probably one of the defining moments of world history. And I wish more people knew about it. As the Western Front bogged down into trench warfare in the fall of 1914, Both sides continually looked for advantages to help them turn the tide against the other. Throughout 1915, the use of mines became routine for both the Central Powers and also the Allies. In June 1916 alone, the Germans had exploded 126 mines across the Western Front, and the British had exploded over 100. Here at the Somme, nearly 20 mines were exploded just on July 1st. The most memorable of those mines was here, and it's known as the Lochnagar mine. Work was started on this mine in December 1915 by the 185th Tunneling Company, and it was eventually finished several months later by the 179th Tunneling Company. The mine itself was over 100 feet deep with 4 separate passageways that came off of the main gallery. As it began to get closer and closer to the German redoubt, which was known as the Swabia Hill, they had to be as quiet as possible. At that depth, they're most likely digging through chalk filled with flint rocks, and you can see the flint rocks all over the place in farmers' fields here. So for silence, the tunnelers would use bayonets with spliced handles, and they would work barefoot on a floor covered with sandbags, all for the sake of silence. The flint rocks, which are everywhere here, were carefully pried out of the chalk and then laid quietly on the floor. One man dug with his bayonet while an assistant caught the dislodged material. That dislodged material, mostly chalk, was then placed in sandbags and passed hand by hand along a row of miners sitting on the floor. This mine was 1,000 feet long. Among the most fascinating aspects of mine warfare are the countermining efforts that took place. It was rarely a secret that the enemy was digging mines. Here at the Somme, the Germans were not only well aware that an attack was coming, they were also well aware that mines were being dug under the strong points on their line. And so they would dig mine shafts of their own, hoping to interfere with or even stop the enemy's mine efforts before they were able to explode their mines. And this led to both sides employing techniques to identify where the enemy was digging. But it wasn't easy. Sound travels differently underground, and so it requires a great deal of silence, it requires a great deal of technology, and it requires a great deal of skill to be able to figure things out. One officer on the British side, a man named Captain Stanley Bullock of the 129th Tunneling Company, described how things went. Here's what he said, quote, "At one place in particular, our men swore they thought he, the German enemy, was coming through. So we stopped driving forward and commenced to chamber in double shifts." That meant building a chamber instead of just a shaft, a gallery. "We did not expect to complete it before he blew, but we did. A chamber 12 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet in just 24 hours. The Germans worked for a shift more than we did, and then they stopped. They knew we had chambered and were afraid that we should blow, and no more work was done there. I used to hate going to listen in that chamber more than any other place in the mine. Half an hour, sometimes once, sometimes 3 times a day, in deadly silence, with a geophone to your ears, wondering whether the sound you heard was the Bosch, which was a derogatory word they used for the Germans. I think it means pig. Working silently, or was it your own heart beating? God knows how we kept our nerves and judgment. After the Somme attack, when we surveyed the German mines and connected up to our own system, we found that we were 5 feet apart, and that he had only started his chamber and then stopped." When they got about 130 feet from the German redoubt, the mine was branched into two separate tunnels so that charges could be placed 60 feet apart, about 50 feet beneath the surface of the German position. One of those rooms was packed with 24,000 pounds of explosives, and the other was packed with 36,000 pounds of explosives. When they exploded at 7:28 a.m. on the morning of July 1st, the debris was estimated to have risen 4,000 feet into the air. That's nearly a mile, before falling back to the earth, burying many of the German defenders. The crater here, known as the Lochnagar crater, is 300 feet across and 90 feet deep. After the explosion came the attack. The 34th Division were all PALS battalions who had answered Lord Kitchener's call and had yet to be tried in battle. They were to make a flanking assault on the German front lines around La Boiselle. The division was made up of the 15th and 16th Royal Scots of Edinburgh City, the 10th Lincolns, who were known as the Grimsby Chums, the 11th Suffolks, who were the Cambridge Pals, and 8 battalions of Northumberland Fusiliers, the Tyneside Scottish and the Tyneside Irish. 2 minutes after the mines exploded, right at 7:30, as with the whole line at that point, the whistles blew and the men went over the top from the safety of their trenches. Over 75% of the men became casualties. In many places, the attackers had to cross nearly half a mile or more of open ground in order to reach the German barbed wire. They were then decimated in no man's land, with survivors seeking refuge down in the newly formed Lochnagar crater. The Scottish Tynesiders attacked up through Mash Valley, spurred on by their pipers, between Wysap crater and La Boiselle to their right. Machine guns tore holes in their lines, and very few made it the 500 yards to the German lines at their position. The Scottish battalions attacking the Swabia Hill strongpoint alongside Lochnagar crater had a shorter distance to go, but an equally terrible machine gun fire again meant that very few reached their objectives. The Irish Tyneside battalions had the greatest distance to make their attacks, 800 yards. They set out from reserve positions nearly a mile behind the British front line when they began. Men were cut down as they moved slowly from the exposed hills. Some did make it forward, with a very small group eventually reaching their objective at Contalmaison, only to be lost later on. When the day was over, the 34th Division had taken 6,500 casualties. That was the most of any British division on the first day at the Battle of the Somme. This is the Auvilliers British Cemetery. It contains the final resting place of about 3,500 British soldiers. 2,500 of them are unknown. It also contains the graves of 100 French soldiers who were killed in 1915 in this area. As I mentioned before, There are men buried all over the Somme, and they continue to be found. In the year 2000, a man who had previously been listed on the tablet at Thiepval of the missing was found. They brought him to the cemetery here, and 1,500 people showed up for the funeral, including members of his family. His name was George Nugent, and he's buried here today. And I really like what it says on his marker. It says, G.J. Nugent, Tyneside, Scottish, NF, and he was killed at the age of 28 on the 1st of July. But at the bottom it says lost, found, but never forgotten. May he rest in eternal peace. The land on which the Lochnagar crater sits today is actually privately owned by a British citizen, a man named Richard Dunning. And he's done an incredible job. It's one of the places on the Somme battlefield where there's the most to see and the most to learn about what happened there. There are these plaques absolutely everywhere, and you can actually go to the website and read the text of all of them. And I'm going to be using the text from some of those plaques in my narration of this site today. But it's really well done. And I would say that if you're ever going to visit the Somme, put the Lochnagar crater right at the top of your list as far as places you visit, because it's a place you can go without having prepared or done any research and really fully understand everything about this site, about the German defenders, about the miners, about the men who fought here. And one really cool aspect to this too, and I'll show you in just a second, I guess probably to raise money for this site. All of the boards on which I'm walking have little plaques at the end of them that are dedicated to various soldiers of the Great War. And I would imagine people probably paid money to do that, and it was a fantastic way to not only honor those men, but also to raise the funds to make this site a place that people can come and visit today. When I was recording for my episode on the men who died at the Somme and visiting the various cemeteries, one of the graves that I visited was that of a soldier by the name of George Nugent, whose body was actually only buried in the National Cemetery in the year 2000. He was found in 1998, took some time to identify him, to prepare everything, and then he was laid to rest in the Auvilliers Cemetery in 2000. Well, this cross here, just a few yards from the edge of the crater, marks the spot where George Nugent's body was found in 1998, here at the edge of the crater. Lieutenant William Hodgson has what appears to be a pretty new grave marker here. 2 days before going over the top on July 1st, Hodgson wrote a poem called Before Action that was published back in Britain. By all the glories of the day and the cool evening's benison, by that last sunset touch that lay upon the hills when the day was done, by beauty lavishly outpoured and blessings carelessly received, by all the days that I have lived, make me a soldier, O Lord. By all of man's hopes and fears and all the wonders poets sing, the laughter of unclouded years and every sad and lovely thing, by the romantic ages stored with high endeavor that was his, by all his mad catastrophes, make me a man, O Lord. I, that on my familiar hill saw with uncomprehending eyes 100 of thy sunsets spill, their fresh and sanguine sacrifice ere the sun swings his noonday sword, must say goodbye to all of this, by all delights that I shall miss. Help me to die, O Lord. Lieutenant Hodgson was killed just 2 days after he wrote those words on the attack on my Mets. This is Sayre Road Cemetery number 1. It's one of around 3,000 British Commonwealth war graves cemeteries here in the Western Front. Not all World War I, some are World War II. But, in my week in France on the Western Front, I have literally walked or driven past the graves of hundreds of thousands of men and women from all over the world. Not just Britain and France and Germany, but I'm standing right here and I'm looking at graves from Australia and New Zealand. There are those from India who fought here, and from Africa, from various nations. And it can get a little overwhelming, and it can be difficult to take in. And so what I try to do is remind myself that every grave I see represents a story, represents a life, and to remember too that hundreds of thousands aren't even in marked graves. They're still out on the battlefield somewhere. But in order to remind us of the real cost of this war, I have tried to take the time to tell some stories of some of the men and women who died in the Great War in the various cemeteries, and I want to do that here today at the Somme. Because the British Commonwealth war graves tend to be in much smaller cemeteries, we're going to walk around several cemeteries today and just share some stories. Come with me as I do that. Horace Iles was 14 years old when he joined up with the Leeds Pals, the West Yorkshire Regiment. His sister wrote a letter to him on July 9th, 1916, anxious for news, and this is what she wrote. "We did hear that they were fetching all back from France under 19. For goodness sake, Horace, tell them how old you are. I'm sure they'll send you back if they know you're only now just 16. You have seen quite enough. Now just chuck it up and try to get back. You won't fare no worse for it. If you don't do it now, you will come back in bits, and we want the whole of you. Your loving sister, Flory. Flory only discovered that Horace had been killed when she received the letter back, unopened, marked, killed in action. That's how she found out her 16-year-old brother was dead. Horace was just 16 when he died with the 15th Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment. He was killed along with 2,000 men of the 31st Division who were killed or wounded in the attack on July 1st. This is the Connaught Cemetery, and it's on the sector of the battlefield where many of the Irish soldiers fought. You can see right behind me the Ulster Tower, which is one of the more famous landmarks on the battlefield, which commemorates the men of the 36th Ulster Division and others, including a number of Irish soldiers. The road that runs along here, it's a modern road that's paved today, but at the time it was known by another name. It was known as the Bloody Road. And as I've mentioned previously, many of the soldiers who died in places like the Bloody Road have never been recovered, and they continue to be recovered from the battlefield, including 3 men who rest in this cemetery today. They were found in 2015. One of the 3 has been identified. We know the units of all 3 of these men, but we do not know the names of 2 of them. And they're here right in the corner of the cemetery. One is a soldier from the Cambridgeshire Regiment, whose name is unfortunately not known. Another is a soldier from the Royal Irish Rifles. And the third is Sergeant D.H. Blakely, who was a member of the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, who died in the initial attacks on July 1st of 1960. This is the Lonsdale Cemetery. It's the final resting place of over 1,500 British soldiers and at least 1 French soldier, which you can see right there with the cross. There may be others, but that's the only one I saw. Of the over 1,500 British soldiers buried here, over half are unknown, which is, at least in my experience so far, fairly unusual. Certainly not that many unknown in most of these cemeteries. This was the site of one of the major attacks that took place on July 1st. Behind me, you see a ridge, and then there's some trees there. And that is an area known as the Leipzig Redoubt, which was a major strong point for the Germans that was attacked on July 1st. And it was attacked coming out of these woods behind me by 2 PALS battalions out of Glasgow, Scotland. They were the 16th Highland Light Infantry, who were known as the Glasgow Boys Brigade, and then the 17th Highland Light Infantry, who were known as the Glasgow Commercials. Well, like many other units, they launched their attack, and it's important to note that they didn't just start attacking at 7:30. Most of these units had moved into position overnight, and many of them had actually, using like trenches that were built toward the German lines and using defensive positions, had crawled up into no man's land to get closer, and then only jumped off, like stood up and started attacking right at 7:30. And that's what happened with these two units of Highland Light Infantry. One second lieutenant named Meadows actually described what happened. He was with the 17th. He said, at 7:25, we left the trench and we walked over to within 60 yards of the barrage. That was the creeping barrage that was leading them toward the German lines. At 7:30, the barrage lifted and we rushed the front line defenses, destroying the garrison in and out of dugouts. I have few definite memories from the time we first saw the Germans to the time the machine guns swept us down outside the Leipzig redoubt. We waited for our own reserve waves and the Lonsdales, who should have come on behind, but no reserves reached us. We began to work toward the communication trench, but owing to the lie of the ground, we were badly exposed, and I at length found myself the only living occupant of that corner. They were unable, unfortunately, to hold it. And the Lonsdales did attempt to come to their aid, but they took heavy casualties as well. And this cemetery is named after the Lonsdales, even though many of the soldiers who are here are from the Highland Light Infantry. And it's one of the Highlanders' stories, one of those boys from Glasgow that I'd like to share with you here. This is Sergeant James Turnbull of the Glasgow Commercials, the Highland Light Infantry. And you can see that it says VC after his name, which means he's a recipient of the Victoria Cross. He was a part of taking the Leipzig redoubt. He was actually a 32-year-old former rugby player. So you can kind of picture in your mind what this man looked like. He helped capture a part of the Leipzig redoubt, which faced several strong German counterattacks later in the day. His official citation reads that he almost single-handed, he maintained his position and displayed the highest degree of valor and skill in performance of his duties. He was killed later on during the day. The largest American cemetery in all of Europe is the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, which I visited a few days ago. Contains the graves of about 14,000 American service members who died here in France during the Great War. The cemetery that I'm standing in now, the Fricourt German cemetery outside the town of Albert, is significantly smaller. I mean, way smaller. Couple of acres. I mean, I would say it has to be a tenth the size of the American cemetery, if not smaller. But there are more Germans buried here than are Americans buried at the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. There are 17,000 Germans in this cemetery at Fricourt. Now, only, I don't know, a couple thousand have these markers, and each one of these markers has 4 names on it. So you can kind of do the math there. The vast majority, probably 10,000 or so, are in these three kind of communal graves, mass graves. And then there are these plaques, these huge plaques that just have thousands of names and dates on them. It's really quite incredible. About 10,000 of the dead here are from the Battle of the Somme. 6,000 or so are from the Kaiserschlacht offensive in the spring of 1918. And then the rest are from the early part of the war and then other parts of the war, including the Allied 100 Days Offensive that came toward the end of 1918. I've said this before, and I'll say it again because it continually just really touches me. The way in which I see the Germans honored here in these various cemeteries, just looking at the main monument up at the head of the cemetery, and there are 3 wreaths full of poppies, which have been laid by the Lochnagar Crater Association, which is a British association. And one of them says, in honor of all the brave Germans who died on the Somme. Germans who died killing British soldiers. I love that 100 years later, despite the differences, despite all that happened between these sides, that sense of honor and decency can be afforded to men who were fighting for their country, regardless of what that country was. This is one of the more unique military cemeteries among those in the Somme. We're in the city of Albert, and we're actually in an extension of the city communal cemetery, the private cemetery for citizens. And French cemeteries are beautiful and very different than what we're used to in the United States, and I'll give you a little bit of a look at that. But here we find the story of a captain of Australian pioneers. And his name was actually a German name. It was Hermann Fritz Hubbe. I don't exactly know how to pronounce that name, but it's Hubbe. And he described moving toward the front in late July, watching an artillery barrage on a German position that they were preparing to attack. And he wrote these words. He said, "Flashes like summer lightning were quick and continuous, making one flickering band of light. Every now and then a low, lurid red flush, very angry, lit the horizon. All around the horizon shells were flashing, and the pretty starlights made their graceful curves." He was killed in that battle to come, and he was buried here. He died on the 23rd of July, 1916. A German who was defending in that same position wrote a letter that was discovered later. He actually wrote it the day that Captain Hubbe was killed. And this is what he told his wife and children. He called it "In Hell's Trenches." "My darlings, the gods only know if I am writing for the last time. We have now been 2 days in the front trenches. It is not a trench, but a little ditch, shattered with shells, with not the slightest cover and no protection. We have already lost about 50 men in 2 days. We get nothing to eat or drink, and life is almost unendurable. To my last moment, I will think of you. There is really no possibility that we shall see each other again. Should I fall, then farewell. This is Flatiron Copse Cemetery. It's the final resting place of 1,500 British Commonwealth soldiers. And I should mention that phrase, that word, that descriptive word, the Commonwealth. For our American audience and others who might not be familiar with it, there are a number of nations that used to be part of what we called the British Empire, but today it's known as the Commonwealth, and so that's the title that is used. All of these cemeteries are operated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and so that's the title that we use. Anyway, like many of the cemeteries, this particular cemetery is kind of out of the way. It's down kind of a back road and doesn't really seem to be connected to any of the major areas of combat, but that just goes to show you just how vast this battlefield was, because these cemeteries are just everywhere. They really are. There's 5 graves I want to take a look at in here, so let's go. First grave I want to highlight here is that of Corporal Edward Dwyer, who received the Victoria Cross for his actions in Ypres, further to the north, before his unit, the 1st Battalion of the East Surreys, was sent here to the Somme. Now, what's remarkable about Corporal Dwyer is that he is one of those rare people for whom we actually have an audio recording of him speaking about the war before he was killed. And that exists to this day, because after he received the Victoria Cross, he was sent back to Britain for a while to do speaking drives and drum up support for the war, things like that. Very similar to what the United States did in World War II with people like John Basilone and the men who raised the flag over Iwo Jima, people that had performed these great acts of heroism that became celebrities back home. And Eddie Dwyer was one of those people.
There was only one thing you could cheer us up on the march, that was singing. We used to sing Tipperary choruses, invented by some of the chaps. Tipperary was in full swing then, and they'd always gone to something they'd invented themselves. It used to buck us up, and we would march all the better for it. Sometimes we'd sing some of T.H. Eliot's songs, you know, the chocolate-coloured coon, but we'd always go into something we'd invented. I don't think I've got much of a voice for singing, but I try and sing 1 or 2 of the choruses we used to sing. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We'd be far better off, far better off, far better off enough. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. Hello, 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 hello. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. Hello, 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 hello. Woo!
As you walk through this cemetery, it's impossible not to notice these two stones, with the exception of two individual inscriptions. They're identical. They're both lieutenants. They're both last name Tregaskis, different first initial. Same regiment, same date of death, 1 year difference on the age. Arthur and Leonard Tregaskis were brothers. They were lieutenants in the same unit, the Welch Regiment, and they were a year apart. One was 32, one was 33, and they were killed within minutes of each other. One of them, I apologize, off the top of my head, I don't remember which one, had been severely wounded, and the other came to his aid to see how he was, to check on his brother, to make sure he was okay, to treat him if necessary, and then he himself was shot and killed. The parents of the Tregaskis brothers received notification about one of them in the morning. They got the notification for the other that night. About 30 feet from the Tregaskis brothers are Thomas and Henry Hardwidge. They were in the same regiment. 4 days after the Tregaskis brothers were killed, Thomas Hardwidge was wounded, and his brother Henry ran to his side to give him water, to give him aid, and both men were shot and killed. I wish I could say that these two sets of brothers were the only story like this, but sadly there were dozens of sets of brothers who fell here on the Somme. It's just a product of the nature of these units, where you have these PALS battalions, in particular these units that are raised from the same towns. Many brothers went to war together, and when you have situations where units are completely torn to pieces in a single day, it's inevitable that you're going to have hundreds of stories of family members, brothers, cousins, friends, entire workplaces, entire neighborhoods that are just wiped out in an instant. But that's the Somme. When Lord Kitchener called for volunteers to join the British Army in 1914, entire towns, entire workplaces joined up together to form what were officially known as service battalions, but unofficially known throughout history as the PALS battalions. Professional footballers were no exception. In London, the entire Clapton Orient team, known today as Leyton Orient, joined the 17th Service Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment. Eventually, that battalion included 122 professional footballers, 26 of whom would not survive the war. Now, a similar battalion was formed in Scotland. 16 players from the Hearts of Midlothian, along with 500 supporters and ticket holders, formed the 16th Service Battalion of the Royal Scots Regiment. They became known as McRae's Battalion in honor of their charismatic colonel, a former member of Parliament for Edinburgh, Sir George McRae. At the time the battalion was raised in November of 1914, Hearts were in first place in the Scottish League. They were eventually joined by players from the Raith Rovers, as well as other professional footballers from Falkirk, Dunfermline, East Fife, and St. Bernard's. By December of 1914, 75 football clubs boasted at least one representative in the 16th Battalion. Once they were activated for service, the battalion was divided into 4 companies, A, B, C, and D. Most of the footballers ended up in Company C, with the other 3 companies being organized around men with similar trades or similar hometowns. In June of 1915, the battalion left Edinburgh to continue their training in Yorkshire, and it seemed as though the entire city turned out to see them off from Waverley Station. In September, they moved to Salisbury Plain, where they became part of the British 34th Division, under command of Major General Edward Charles Inglevill Williams, better known to all the men in the ranks as Inky Bill. On the 18th of December, the men were issued sun helmets along with baggy shorts and tropical equipment. It seemed as though they were headed for Egypt, where many of the other newly formed battalions had gone, but a week later their orders were changed. The men were headed to France. McRae's battalion arrived in France on the line on the Kaiser's birthday, January 27th, and they were welcomed by the heaviest bombardment ever seen in that sector. More than 2,000 shells crashed down on them, but thankfully only one man was wounded. The following morning, the bombardment resumed, and 19-year-old Private Robert Russell from Dunfermline became the battalion's first casualty. During their initial deployment, McRae's battalion lost around 8 men killed and 20 wounded. On the 14th of April, they marched to the village of Houle near St. Omer for 2 weeks of additional training. Lieutenant Henry Rawson was a platoon commander in D Company, and he wrote to his uncle saying this: "I think we are getting ready for a show. I don't know where, and I couldn't tell you if I did, but I know that when it comes, we will be ready. The boys are spoiling for a scrap, and I think they'll prove a handful for the Hun." That scrap was to come on July 1st, 1916, here along the Somme River. The 16th Royal Scots were to be a part of the 34th Division's attack on one of the most important sectors of the front, the German position at La Boiselle. Rather than attack the village head on, the attack would come on either side of the town through areas known as Mash Valley and Sausage Valley, which is behind me here. At around 1/3 of a mile, the valleys were the widest section of no man's land anywhere on the Somme attack front. The 16th would follow behind the 15th Royal Scots and attack an area overlooking Sausage Valley known as the Scots Redoubt. In support of the attack, a hurricane bombardment consisting of 250,000 artillery shells rained down on the German frontline trenches along the front that morning. 19 mines were exploded in the minutes before the attack, the largest of which was the Lochnagar mine, which is where I'm located right now, just to the left of the Scots position. So I'm standing right at the corner of the Gordon Dump Cemetery because I wanted to show you this breathtaking view that shows pretty much the entire area over which the men of the 101st Brigade attacked. Straight ahead of us, where you can see some cars, that is the Loch Nagar crater. This in front of us, the dip, that is Sausage Valley. There's woods in the distance there, past the crater. Right in front of those woods would have been where the men of the Royal Scots would have lined up. The 101st Brigade would have started their attack right there. They would have come in this direction. The attack was meant to come pretty much straight at us. Contextualize is behind us. The Scots redoubt is just, I believe, to our left from here. But somewhere between here and the Loch Nagar crater, in that area, they would have been overwhelmed by machine gun fire, and they would have made a right turn over toward those trees in the distance there. And we'll show you what that looks like when we talk about that part. But such a magnificent view of the entire field of Sausage Valley. The 15th Royal Scots were the first to jump off. That was supposed to happen at 7:30, and then they were to begin crossing the 600 meters of no man's land between their position there and the German frontline position here. McRae's battalion were right behind them. Things went wrong almost immediately after they took the German frontline trench. The 10th Lincolns, which were on their left and would have attacked directly toward the Loch Nagar crater, waited an extra 5 minutes out of fear of being hit from falling debris from the crater. Now this subjected the Scots to a terrible flanking fire from German machine guns in the second trench line. That caused them to veer. Instead of going straight through Sausage Valley here, they veered off to the right, and they ended up crossing into the 21st Division's sector over there. Now, despite suffering heavy casualties already, the men of McRae's battalion were able to take shelter and regroup here along what was then a sunken road behind these woods. There's a little bit of a crest here, and these woods behind me are known as Shelter Wood. They offered some protection and shelter from the German strongpoints on the other side of this hill. Now, along with the 11th Suffolks and the 27th Tyneside Irish, the men were able to head north from here after regrouping and take a German strongpoint known as Scott's Redoubt. For the next 3 days, they held on to that redoubt, and that allowed them to help the British to hang on to some of the modest gains that they had made in the area here around La Boiselle. Elements of McRae's battalion and others did eventually make their way into Contextualize, becoming some of the furthest advanced of any British troops on the 1st of July. And because of that, the memorial to McRae's battalion was placed here in town. It's a cairn, which is very consistent with the identity of the Scottish. And it's quite appropriate, and it's a beautiful monument here. It was placed in 2004. Now let's talk about casualties. The 16th Battalion of the Royal Scots, those professional footballers who had so eagerly signed up in the early days of the war. Well, they lost 12 officers and 573 men in this attack. Nearly 80% of the men who went over the top on July 1st. The division as a whole, the 34th Division, lost nearly 7,000 men. The worst casualties for any of the divisions that went over the top on July 1st. Most of the men of McCrae's battalion who died on the 1st of July have no known graves and are instead remembered on the tablets for the missing at Thiepval. But it's likely that many of them lie here in the Gordon Dump Cemetery among around 1,000 unidentified burials here. One of the 19 marked graves for men of the battalion belongs to Captain Lionel Coles. He was the company commander in charge of the footballers who fought here that day. Now, in a letter that he wrote in 1928, Colonel McCrae wrote about what happened here at the Somme. He said, "In the flames, I see the faces of my boys, so young and full of promise. The sorrow and pride are overwhelming. Sorrow at the loss and pride in the manner of their dying. They never flinched. Faced by a veritable storm of shot and shell, they marched toward the guns beside their friends. In remembering them, we must acknowledge our debt and find some way to justify our own lives, so that when we meet our comrades in that better place, we are able to say with a brave heart that we did not let them down." Walter Lloyd was a private with the East Lancashire Regiment, though here at the Somme he was actually attached to a Manchester battalion, and that's who he was fighting with very near to Ginchy when he was killed on August 26th, 1916. I never would have known Walter Lloyd's name except for the fact that I was on eBay a few months ago looking at World War I memorabilia, and one of his medals was for sale. If you're not familiar with these medals, the British War Medal and the Victory Medal, they're inscribed really small on the side with the service number and name of the soldier to whom they were presented. In this case, posthumously given to his wife and daughter. Her name was Bridget, the wife, and his young only child. Her name was Monica, and she was just a few years old when her dad was killed here. A couple of weeks later, somebody sent me a message that another one of Walter Lloyd's medals was up for sale on eBay, and so I was able to acquire that one as well. I haven't been able to find out a lot about his story, honestly. I know that he was living in Accrington when the war broke out. He was working as a bricklayer with his father and his older brother Robert. I know that Robert went off first and enlisted in the East Lancashire Regiment, the same battalion that Walter would end up in. And Robert was killed somewhere near Plug Street Wood outside of Ypres in December of 1914. Right about the time that word got back to Accrington that Robert had been killed, Walter enlisted. I don't know if he was looking to take his brother's place, or if he was inspired, or if it's just a coincidence, the timing. But that's what ended up happening. Unfortunately, Walter's service record was destroyed, like many service records, in a fire. And so I wasn't able to find much beyond a pension that was paid to his wife and child, and a little bit of information about these medals that were presented to him. But it is my honor to be able to come here and bring this photo of Walter, and maybe for the first time ever, I don't know, I have no way of knowing, bring his medals to where he lies today. His daughter Monica died in 2005, and as far as I could tell, there is no surviving family for Walter today. If there is, and if any of you maybe watching are able to connect me with some relative of Walter's, I would love very much to return these medals to his family. Behind me where the trees are is the Hawthorne Ridge crater. It's the site of one of nearly 20 mines that were exploded by the British on the morning of July 1st, 1916 to signal the start of the Somme offensive. It's one of the most well-known of the craters and one of only a few that can still be seen today. The area that was targeted by the mine was known as Hawthorne Ridge Redoubt. That's the ridge there. It was a German frontline fortification west of the village of Beaumont-Hamel on the Somme River. The redoubt was built after the end of the Battle of Albert in late September 1914, so the Germans had been there for the better part of a year and a half, almost 2 years at this point. And as the French and later the British attacks on the Western Front became more and more formidable, the Germans continued to build up the fortifications and trench positions near their original lines around Hawthorne Ridge. No man's land in this sector ranged anywhere from between 200 and 500 yards between the British and the German lines. The ground's mostly flat and clear of obstructions. It's got hills, sloping ridges, but there's one tiny spot in all of this sector that's not flat and in the open, and that is this low bank known as the Sunken Ridge, and we're going to take a look at that in just a minute. This is a commanding position for the Germans. They could use it for artillery observers to easily see the British lines and to be able to fire and coordinate that fire effectively. The British, on the other hand, couldn't see past the German support trenches. And the shape of this land, which is much more hilly than I thought it would be, the shape of the land here makes it very difficult for heavy artillery for the British to hit those German frontline positions. And so as the British prepared for their offensive along the Somme, the 29th Division was given the task of taking the Hawthorne Ridge redoubt. To try and make their job a little bit easier, the division employed a series of miners to dig mines for communication, for transportation, and of course for explosives detonation. The 252nd Tunneling Company of the Royal Engineers, who were nicknamed the Moles, were given the task. The main gallery was dug 60 feet underground and stretched 1,000 yards. That's more than a half a mile from the British lines to the strong point under the redoubt where those trees are. The mine was then packed with 40,000 pounds of explosives made from ammonium nitrate and aluminum powder. The 8th Corps commander, Lieutenant General Amer Hunter Weston, that's a mouthful of a name, wanted the mine to be set off actually 4 hours before the attack, so the Germans would think the attack was coming and then let their guard down when nothing happened. But that was overruled by 4th Army headquarters, and they decided that all mines should be detonated no more than just a few minutes before the attack. So every day for the week preceding the attack, a bombardment would commence at 5 a.m. You figure if you're the Germans, after a while, you really just don't know what's happening because no attack's coming. So the hope was that the Germans would think no attack was imminent when the bombardment occurred on the morning of the attack. So on the morning of July 1st, the men of the 29th Division were to advance east across the valley behind a creeping barrage that would get closer and closer to the German lines. They would first secure the very first line of defenses and then follow that artillery barrage as it crept further to the east so they could capture additional trench lines throughout the day. The Hawthorne Ridge mine was set to go off 10 minutes before the attack. That's several minutes before any of the other mines along the line. And the hope was that the German attention would be focused here and not on more strategic locations where the 10th Corps and the 15th Corps were going to be attacking further to the south. British cinematographer Geoffrey Maylands was on hand to film the attack by the 29th Division. The men of the 1st Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers had moved out into no man's land to this spot behind me known as the Sunken Road, which is one of the very few spots anywhere on this part of the battlefield where you can get some cover and not be out in the open. There's this iconic footage of the men of that unit here waiting to go over the top after the mine exploded. Within a half hour of that footage being shot, many of those men would be dead on the battlefield. Malins then went to another location and set up his camera to record the explosion of the Hawthorne mine from about a half a mile away. Here's what he said about it. He said, quote, "The ground where I stood gave a mighty convulsion. It rocked and swayed. I gripped hold of my tripod to steady myself. Then for all the world, like a gigantic sponge, the earth rose high in the air to the height of hundreds of feet. Higher and higher it rose, and with a horrible grinding roar, the earth settles back on itself, leaving in its place a mountain of smoke." End quote. As soon as the mine blew, the British artillery opened with what was known as a hurricane bombardment of the German lines. This was meant to be a quick but devastating precision artillery strike on the focal point of the attack. It didn't have the desired effect. 2 platoons of the 2nd Battalion Royal Fusiliers, along with 4 machine guns and 4 Stokes mortars, went over the top and rushed toward the crater. The German position here at the Hawthorne Ridge crater was defended by the 119th Regiment of the 26th Reserve Division. A soldier here on Hawthorne Ridge described from the German perspective what happened. Quote, "A huge explosion occurred. It was clear that this was not the result of shelling. A terrible rain of earth and stone was coming down on us, and a gigantic cloud of dust and smoke was rising into the air just in front of where the 9th Company was positioned. The English had dug a tunnel towards a protruding corner of our defenses, which they called the Hawthorne Redoubt, and they had blown a huge mine below it. More than 3 groups, and there'd be 10 to 12 men in a group, of the 1st Platoon of 9th Company were killed outright. The dugouts next to them collapsed, trapping the men of 4 other groups inside. Only 2 groups could be rescued in time. The explosion had left a crater with a diameter of 50 to 60 meters and a depth of 30 meters, and had set the signal for the start of the attack. As the Germans looked out, the sun could be seen reflecting on the English bayonet. They were carrying bridges and wooden planks with them to cross the trenches. He said 8 dense waves were coming up toward us. Horse artillery and cavalry could be observed. English staff officers were observing the assault, and the Germans could see all of this. He went on to say the 10th and 11th Company greeted the English with a withering hail of machine gun and rifle fire, and the section of 9th Company, which had been taken out of action by the mine, English bomb throwers and machine gunners managed to break into our trenches toward the left of the huge crater. Here, 3rd Platoon was still trapped inside a large dugout whose 4 exits had been collapsed when the mine was blown. One of these exits was just being opened up by one of the men. Behind this man were Lieutenant Breitmeyer and Oberleutnant Mühlbayer. There was another German soldier who also wrote about what happened, and he described what happened next. Quote, "We had only just opened the exit of the dugout when they were upon us. A bayonet thrust killed the man who was holding the shovel. His body fell down the stairs of the dugout, tearing the men that were just in the process of getting down out again. I had no rifle with me, but managed to fire a signal flare into the face of one of the attackers. The English answered by throwing some hand grenades, which forced us to withdraw back inside the dugout. A short and intense close combat developed in which the English were annihilated. Their leader, a most brave lieutenant, was wounded and taken prisoner. The platoon of 9th Company, who had just escaped from the collapsed dugout, now fanned out to man the defenses, just in time to open fire on yet another wave of English infantry supported by machine guns. It was then the enemy broke and started toward his lines in retreat. At 11:30 hours, everything was over." I think it's important to remember as I stand in the middle of the Hawthorne Ridge crater that this is a war grave. There were dozens of German soldiers who were annihilated when this bomb exploded. Many of them probably blown into unrecoverable pieces, but also many buried beneath the tons of earth that were thrown into the air, and you can see that in the video. And so probably many of them have never been recovered, and this is their final resting place. There is a sign here. It says Den Toten Kameraden, and it has a list of men who were killed on July 1st, and I'll just read a few of their names. Wehrmann Jacob Noblicht, Reservist Martin Waller, Reservist Eugen Kohler, Musketeer Lenhard Bloch, Musketeer Eugen Zundel, Unterofficer Thomas Fischer. All of those and many other names on this list all died July 1st, 1960. We're standing now in the Beaumont Hamel British Cemetery. You can see just right there the Hawthorne Ridge crater. Just where these trees are is where the sunken lane is. And so many of these men were men that came up and over and probably died right in this field. I thought this, however, was unusual in this cemetery. you see a member of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment who was killed in November. November, there was another significant attack on Hawthorne Ridge, which finally took the position. And so in a lot of these cemeteries, you'll see a lot of July dates and a lot of November dates, because men were killed in the same location, fighting over the same ground at different times. Here you see Private J.W. Jackson of the Lancashire Fusiliers, who was killed probably very near to this spot on July 1st. But then it's right here, what's next, that surprised me. It's an unknown German soldier who somehow ended up in the middle of this British cemetery and has been given the same similar type of marker that all the British soldiers are. And that's one of the things that continues to surprise me in my time in France, is the honor that has been shown to the Germans, to their soldiers. It's it warms my heart, but I would totally understand if they didn't feel that way. They were invaded by these people, and yet they show great honor to them, not only from the French, but the British as well. There are around 100,000 members of the British and Commonwealth forces who were killed here at the Somme. Add to that tens of thousands of French soldiers and others, of course all the German soldiers that were killed here. And when you add up the killed, wounded, missing, captured, you're looking at over 1 million casualties, making the Somme one of the deadliest battles in human history. And so there are countless stories of the men who fell here that we can share. And I've done a previous episode talking about the stories of the fallen, and I have a feeling there will be many more after this one. So I want to invite you to join me as we explore the battlefield of the Somme today and share some more of the stories of the fallen. The Martinsart Cemetery here on the Somme battlefield is unique in that, as you can see behind me, the grave markers are not white the way they normally are. These are red sandstone. They really just don't pop, they don't jump out the way the white ones do, but it was an opportunity to try something different, and that's what they did. So we're going to take a look around a little bit, talk about the men of the Royal Naval Reserve, in particular, one of the heroes of that unit. Walking among the graves of the Somme battlefield, you'll occasionally see men from the Navy. And that, of course, begs the question, what were men in the Navy doing at a place like the Somme, which is far from the ocean? And these cemeteries aren't even particularly close to the Somme River. Well, the Royal Naval Reserve included foot soldiers, and so a lot of these men were fighting just right alongside members of the Army and the cavalry and other units. And one such man was Frederick Septimus Kelly. Now, he's a guy we could do an entire video about. A fascinating story. Went to Eton, went to Oxford, was on the 1908 gold medal winning team, an 8-man rowing team for the British in the London Olympics that year. and went on to be a renowned pianist and composer. In fact, his final composition was called Somme Lament, and was just 2 weeks before he was killed. When he was killed, it was in the final days of the Somme offensive, and like many officers, Lieutenant Commander Kelly was leading a unit in rushing a machine gun position when he was killed. Unlike many of the other composers who died here at the Somme, he has a marked grave, and it's right here. This is the Guillemont Road Cemetery. It's on kind of the extreme right flank of the British Somme offensive. It was originally a rather small cemetery with a little over 100 graves, mostly from the Guards Division. But after the war was over, it became a collecting point cemetery for surrounding cemeteries, and it now contains over 2,000, as you can see. A pretty substantial burying place. Most of the graves in this particular cemetery are actually known, and there's one in particular of note that I want to take a look at. Lieutenant Raymond Asquith wasn't just another lieutenant in the Grenadier Guards. His father was the Prime Minister for the first few years of the Great War. And because his father was Prime Minister, his father tried hard to get him pulled from the front lines, put into like an intelligence job or something where he'd be a little bit safer. But Raymond was not one who wanted to be seen as shirking his duty. And so he did spend some time off the front lines, but eventually in 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, he was with his men. And as time got close for an attack that was to come in September of 1916, Asquith, who was not a particularly religious man, spent some time at church and started to write and speak in such a way that it seemed like maybe he might have had a sense that his time was coming. Well, his time came during an attack on the 15th of September 1916, the same day that the very first use of tanks happened on the battlefield here at the Somme. And he was leading his men over the top. He blew the trench whistle, climbed up, made it just a few feet from the trench before his chest was riddled with machine gun fire. He did initially survive long enough to be able to light up a cigarette to try and inspire his men and let them know that he was okay and that he was brave. But he unfortunately succumbed to his wounds. And his father, Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister, spent a few more months in office before he was replaced in December of that year by David Lloyd George. So just outside of the town of Poitiers, we have the cemetery. It's really quite impressive. It's one of the more impressive ones that you'll find on the Western Front, with these columns outside, and then just a beautiful location. So here at the Poitiers Memorial to the Missing, this one really just got to me. It's left by a family, and it has a photo of Rifleman Frederick Wayne of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, and has a message with it. It just says, "My name is Frederick Wayne. I married Florence Capper and enlisted in the King's Royal Rifle Corps in 1915. As a coal miner, I could have been exempt from service. However, I joined up with 6 chums. I was posted to the 9th Battalion and survived 3 years in the trenches, only to be hit by a shell in the German Spring Offensive on the 24th of March 1918 while serving with the 11th Battalion here on the Somme. I have no known grave, only my name carved on this memorial. please remember me. And then there are 2 crosses, and it says, in loving memory, Frederick Wayne, forever remembered by your family. Yeah, that one really got to me. If you were 66 years old, you would probably feel that you had already done your part for society. You certainly wouldn't think at that age that you would enlist to fight in the Great War. In fact, you would have been a couple of decades too old to even join up in the first place. But that was not going to stop Harry Weber. Harry Weber tried to join at 66. He was rejected. He then tried to raise his own company of soldiers that he could take to the front, but that too was rejected. But eventually he found his way into a commission and was serving with the South Lancashire Regiment, delivering supplies to the front, making sure that the men had all of the things that they needed to be able to fight and fight well. Now, Harry was also the proud father of 3 officers in the British Army. 2 were majors and 1 was a brigadier general. So this was a military family. And Harry was doing his part when an 18-inch shell landed about 15 yards away from him, and it killed 10 men, 3 horses, and mortally wounded Harry. He was evacuated but died soon after. And he is buried here today on the Somme battlefield, believed to be the oldest man who was killed fighting for the British Army in the Great War. Also here in Dartmoor Cemetery is Private James Miller, who was a recipient of the Victoria Cross. The London Gazette in September of 1916 recorded his actions at Bazentine-le-Petit Wood here at the Somme on July 30th. It says his battalion was consolidating a position after its capture by assault. Private Miller was ordered to take an important message under heavy shell fire and rifle fire and to bring back a reply at all costs. He was compelled to cross open ground, and on leaving the trench was shot almost immediately in the back, the bullet coming out through his abdomen. In spite of this, with heroic courage and self-sacrifice, he compressed with his hand the gaping wound in his abdomen, delivered his message, staggered back with the answer, and fell at the feet of the officer to whom he delivered it. He gave his life with a supreme devotion to duty. Every family who lost a loved one suffered during this war, but some suffered more than others. George and Robert Lee were father and son, aged 44 and 19. They were both serving in the Royal Field Artillery, and it's likely, based on the records, that they were killed by the same shell. And they are buried here side by side. Private John Sweeney was born in Tasmania and serving with a New Zealand regiment here at the Somme when he went AWOL. He deserted. A few weeks later, he was arrested. He was tried for desertion. And on the 2nd of October, 1916, he was shot at dawn. Now, you'll notice here that it says nothing about his execution on the graves, and that was an intentional choice. None of the 300 or so men in the British and Commonwealth forces who were shot at dawn have any indication of that on their grave marker, but there was a scheduled public announcement that was going to be made in New Zealand in which it would be made common knowledge who the men were who had been shot at dawn rather than simply killed on the battlefield. And just before that announcement went public, John's father took his own life. It was unfortunately a tragedy that went beyond just his own actions, but brought a lot of pain to that family. I don't know the circumstances of John's desertion, but in many of those cases, there was a severe degree of post-traumatic stress going on that wasn't diagnosed or understood. And we did a whole video on that, my video of Shot at Dawn from Poppering in the Ypres salient, if you want to know more. Well, this is one of the most beautiful spots on the Somme battlefield. It's Sausage Valley that you see in front of us, and we did a video talking about the McRae's Battalion footballers. These were professional football players, or soccer to our American friends, who fought in this valley. And right over there where the bus is, you can see that is the site of the Lac Nagar crater. It was the largest of all of the mines that were exploded on July 1st, 1916. And right here is the Gordon Dump Cemetery. We talked a little bit about some of the men who are buried there in that previous video, but there's one more that I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about. Like a number of the men buried here in the Gordon Dump Cemetery, Donald Bell was a professional football player before the war. He played for teams such as Newcastle and Crystal Palace, and joined up with the Yorkshire Regiment in a unit known as the Green Howards. He was a second lieutenant and was beloved by his men. He was praised highly, and his Batman, among others, just repeatedly talked about just how much they adored following this man. And that's all you could ask for, is a man that you not only love, but that leads well and leads by example. And that's what Donald Bell did on two separate occasions in the opening weeks of the Battle of the Somme. In both occasions, they were pinned down by machine gun fire, and Bell would approach those machine guns with grenades and with small arms fire and destroy them. It happened once, for which he was eventually given posthumously the Victoria Cross, and it happened again on the day that he was killed. He actually went forward that second time with handfuls and pockets full of what they called bombs, grenades, and was lobbing them toward machine guns to take them out. And he was severely wounded during that attack, but it probably saved the lives of dozens, if not more, of his men. And today he lies here in the Gordon Dump Cemetery. Donald Bell, professional football player, hero of the Somme.